At age 64, Steve Young still stands in the history of American football as an untouchable monument, a legend whose achievements have transcended the confines of a stadium. He is the greatest left-handed quarterback of all time, the two-time NFL MVP, the man who shattered the passer rating record for years on end, and the one who left the entire nation in awe at Super Bowl 29, when he threw 6 touchdown passes, a feat that to this day sends shivers down the spines of experts whenever it is mentioned. He guided the 49ers through a chaotic transition period, stood firm under the pressure of succeeding Joe Montana, and became the face of San Francisco's proud spirit. After retiring, he continued to conquer national television as a sharp, honest, and deeply insightful ESPN analyst. In business, he built HGGC into one of the strongest private equity firms in America. In the community, his Forever Young Foundation has been a lifeline for thousands of disadvantaged children, where the Mormon values of compassion, humility, and service that he holds dear are turned into real action. In the minds of Americans, Steve Young has never been just a great athlete. He is a symbol of discipline, intelligence, and kindness. Yet behind those glittering golden pages lies a darkness that only those who have traded their bodies for the NFL can truly understand. At 64, every morning for him is a battle. His back stiffens as if pulled by steel wires, his head throbs like someone hammering on his skull, and his memory sometimes fogs over like mist. 7 concussions didn't just rob him of his youth on the field, they still haunt him like ghosts. Sudden pains, moments when he can't recall a seemingly simple detail, nights when he wakes in silence, afraid that his body is betraying him in the way time so often does to NFL players. He no longer runs, no longer throws the ball, but he still has to fight against the aftermath, against forgetting, against the fear that old age is coming faster than it does for ordinary men. Yet it is precisely in those painful moments that Steve Young's will shines brightest. He still trains regularly, still reads books, still analyzes games with the same razor-sharp mind as before. He devotes time to his wife, his children, his faith, as if every day is a thank you for still being here, still standing, still able to love. He never complains. He never blames the NFL or fate. Steve Young still lives like a warrior, quietly, proudly, and never bowing to any wound that life has left on his body. If you want to continue the journey delving deeper into the silent tragedies behind Steve Young's glory, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. And if this story touches you, please leave a like so we know you're joining us on this deeply human journey. Steve Young's childhood did not carry the appearance of loud tragedy, no shouting or violent beatings, but it was filled with silent storms that only he could feel. While America saw a resilient, powerful player charging through massive defensive lines, they could hardly imagine that before becoming that man, Steve Young had been a small boy, trembling before the world, living with an invisible fear he himself couldn't fully understand. Separation anxiety, a condition rarely properly named in the 1960s, clung to him like a shadow. On nights in his small room, after his parents turned off the lights and the Mormon household sank into strict silence, Steve felt his chest tighten. He gasped for breath, his heart pounding in irregular rhythms, not because of the dark, not because of bad dreams, but because he feared having to leave his family the next day for school, feared stepping out of the safe circle that a 6-year-old boy saw as his very life. Some nights he lay still, eyes wide open, tears streaming onto his pillow, trying not to make a sound so his parents wouldn't worry. In Steve Young's childhood, the pain wasn't bruises on the skin, it was a small heart in constant panic before the vast world out there. Every morning when he woke to the sound of church music from the living room radio, Steve knew he would soon face what he dreaded most, leaving the embrace of his family. Just a few steps away from them, his body would tremble, his breathing quicken, his hands turn ice cold. No one understood why such a smart, well-behaved child was so terrified. No one recognized it as real panic attacks. To his parents, people who lived by the discipline of the Mormon faith, Steve's fear was just being spoiled, a challenge he had to overcome on his own. And because he didn't want to disappoint them, the boy began learning to hide it. Steve Young early understood that in his family, weakness was something to keep hidden. His father, a calm and principled man, wanted Steve to be strong and steady like other children. His mother, gentle but with high expectations, always wanted her son to grow up independent. No one meant to hurt him, but no one saw his pain, and that was what made it so cruel. At school, Steve never felt like he belonged, even with friends, even when teachers praised his athletic talent. Deep down the boy always felt like he was pretending to be okay, pretending to be brave, pretending not to be afraid. Every recess was an internal battle, every trip away from home was an exhausting trial. Sometimes just losing sight of his mother for a few minutes would make him feel like he was falling into a void. Those who met Steve back then only saw a polite, intelligent, agile boy, but they never knew that every smile was an effort. Every time he tried to act normal, he had to fight the undertow surging inside him. The Mormon boy thought faith could help him overcome it, and to some extent it did, but when faith combined with overly strict discipline, Steve began to feel broken in a way he couldn't put into words. Why am I so afraid? Why am I not like the other kids? Those questions haunted him for years, and then to avoid disappointing his parents or bothering anyone, Steve Young chose silence. Silence in enduring breathless nights, silence in holding back tears each morning as he stepped out the door, silence about the truth that he always felt weaker than everyone around him. In that silence, a quiet tragedy took shape, pain no one acknowledged, not teachers, not friends, not family. No one knew that the boy was living with a form of suffering no visible wound could describe, and from that very pain, Steve Young unexpectedly began becoming the warrior that America would later revere, because sometimes, the strongest people are the children who had to hide their fears to keep going. When Steve Young walked through the gates of Brigham Young University, suitcase in hand, eyes looking up at the vast buildings under the pale blue Utah sky, he had no idea he was stepping into one of the most painful yet defining periods of his life. For many 18-year-olds, college means freedom, discovery, a door opening to the wider world. But for Steve, it was a mental shock he was completely unprepared for. On his first day away from family, he had to sit alone in his dorm room for nearly 2 hours, trying to steady his breathing as anxiety gripped his chest. A young man with an athletic build, exceptional height, the muscles of a natural-born athlete, yet trembling like an abandoned child. Without the warmth of his Mormon home, without his mother's gentle voice, without his father's familiar presence, the separation anxiety returned stronger than ever. He always tried to appear calm, always smiled when meeting new people, always said he was fine, but every evening when the dorm door closed, Steve felt empty, as if his soul had been pulled from his body. He tried calling home, listening to his parents' voices to calm down, but when he hung up, the silence enveloped the room again, and the old fear returned like a familiar shadow. Even though he made the BYU football team, one of the most prestigious quarterback programs in America, Steve felt no pride, no sense of belonging. Every practice was a struggle against stronger teammates, against a coach demanding perfection, but most importantly against himself. Steve's body was strong, flexible, faster than most college athletes, but his soul was fragile as paper. Just a small criticism, a disappointed look from the coach, or a careless play, and anxiety would swallow him whole. There were days he left practice early, hurrying to the bathroom to hide his tears, not from physical pain, but from feeling he wasn't good enough. BYU, with its strict discipline and enormous expectations, was no place for fragile souls, and Steve knew it. Some nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering, am I broken? Am I any different from that little kid back then? Steve himself has said he thought about quitting the team many times, not because he lacked passion, but because he was too afraid of having to prove himself every day. Physical contact drills didn't faze him, but the feeling of being watched, judged, demanded of, that was what crushed his heart. A bad throw would keep him up all night. An imperfect practice would make him feel like a failure. In reality, Steve wasn't just an athlete learning to play better. He was a young man learning to survive in his own mind. Throughout that period, loneliness was his only constant companion. Though BYU was full of students, though he had teammates, coaches, a packed schedule, Steve often felt like he was living in a separate world. He tried to fit in, tried to become the strong man society expected, but every time the dorm door closed, he returned to the primal fear of his childhood, the fear of being left alone, and because he couldn't share it with anyone, that fear grew, clinging to Steve day by day, hour by hour. The Mormon faith, the belief he'd been taught since childhood, became the only thing Steve could cling to. He read scriptures, prayed, sought peace in rituals, in spiritual connection to something greater than himself. But sometimes, even faith couldn't chase away the feeling that he was broken in a place no one could see. Every time he stood alone on an empty practice field, Steve felt that truth clearly. This body was strong enough to face the biggest NFL defenses in the future, but this heart was too fragile to face loneliness. That was the first war Steve Young had to fight before battling any team. A war with no audience, no referee, no scoreboard. A war in the dark, where the only opponent was himself, the person he never felt was good enough. And from those BYU years, Steve Young understood that his life would never be just about beautiful passes or MVP titles. It would be a journey of overcoming himself, one anxiety attack, one lonely night, one moment of wondering if he would be broken forever. When Steve left BYU to enter the NFL, he thought he had escaped the fiercest mental battle of his youth. But the cruel truth was far harsher. Those college years were merely the warm-up for a bigger, more painful, and lonelier storm. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the first team to take in Steve Young, were the weakest team in the NFL at that time. A franchise that even its own fans had no expectations for, a place where every young quarterback got swallowed whole before having a chance to grow. And Steve, with all his sincerity, sensitivity, and discipline, stepped into it like a warrior wearing thin armor. No one could prepare him for the brutality of those Sunday afternoons in Tampa. The air scorching hot, the stadium filled with boos and years of accumulated disappointment. Steve Young, the man who once trembled leaving home as a child, who once cried silently from loneliness at BYU, now had to stand in front of tens of thousands of people demanding victory, demanding strength, demanding the grit he was still searching for within himself. From the very first day holding the ball for the Buccaneers, Steve felt that harshness pierce through his skin. Opposing defenses repeatedly broke through the team's weak offensive line. Steve got sacked, slammed down, shoved into the turf as if his body were just a punching bag. Each fall, the burning ground pressed against his face, sweat and dirt mixing with blood from a split lip. Tampa Bay fans showed no mercy. They shouted, "This guy isn't it. He's not NFL material." The media sneered. Steve Young, another failed experiment. Tampa's hopeless quarterback. Every word stabbed like needles into a mind that was already fragile. Steve had never been used to public humiliation. At BYU his pain was silent, but in the NFL, that pain was magnified in front of millions watching on television. Missed throws, consecutive sacks, endless losses, it all piled up into a pressure that kept Steve awake night after night. Many nights in hotel rooms after games, Steve sat alone at the table, room lights off, only the faint yellow glow from streetlights filtering through the window. His hands trembled as they rested on his forehead, his breathing heavy, the old fear returning. "I'm not good enough, I don't belong in the NFL." He didn't say it to teammates, didn't say it to coaches, didn't say it to anyone. But inside, those words echoed like a curse. Steve has said that Tampa Bay was the first time in his career he truly felt crushed, not just physically, but mentally. Each fall didn't just hurt his body, it shattered the small fragments of confidence he had painstakingly built since BYU. Tampa wasn't a place where people were nurtured. Tampa was a place to test who was steel enough not to break. And Steve, though muscular and strong, was still inside the boy who once trembled, leaving his family's embrace. Many nights, Steve looked in the mirror and saw his face pale from exhaustion. Am I the team's mistake? That question choked him up. The NFL wasn't like college. Here no one cared who you used to be. No one noticed if you were sensitive or easily hurt. No one asked if you were okay. The NFL only asked, do you win? And when you didn't win, the NFL crushed you. Tampa Bay was where Steve learned a painful lesson. Talent wasn't enough. Heart wasn't enough. Will wasn't enough. And fear had no place to exist. But what made the Tampa years breaking point number one in Steve's life wasn't the losses. It was the first time he truly felt that football, the thing he loved, the thing he'd devoted his entire youth to, could destroy him from the inside. Once after a heavy loss, Steve returned to his hotel room, sat on the floor because his legs were weak from too many hits. He rested his head on a pillow, closed his eyes, and thought, if they cut me tomorrow, what will I do? Do I even deserve to be in the NFL? In Tampa, Steve Young lost faith in himself. It wasn't faith stolen. It was faith he willingly handed over bit by bit, after every time he was slammed down. But in that collapse, something no one saw began to sprout. A tiny seed of life, a quiet flame beneath the ashes of failure. Tampa Bay crushed Steve Young, but it was also in that darkest place that his will began to be reborn. No one knew, Steve didn't know either, but the NFL would soon have to face a stronger, sharper, and more resilient version of that man. It just meant that before reaching that light, Steve still had to go through many more circles of hell, and Tampa Bay was only the first. Leaving Tampa Bay, the place that had crushed the confidence of a young man, Steve Young thought San Francisco would be where he would be reborn. The 49ers at that time were the mightiest empire in the NFL, the home of legends, where discipline, strategy, and the spirit of winning were elevated to a religion. But Steve didn't know he was about to step into an even deeper tragedy, becoming the guy replacing Montana. Joe Montana, the uncrowned king of the NFL, was the man the entire country worshipped. A perfect quarterback, cool, precise, elegant in every throw. And when Steve Young joined the 49ers, he didn't just join a team, he stepped into the enormous shadow of a legend no one wanted to replace. From the first day wearing red and gold, Steve felt the strange, skeptical looks from his teammates. No one said it out loud, but the atmosphere alone was enough to suffocate the weak-hearted. Whispered conversations in the weight room, probing glances when Steve missed a throw, offhand comments that cut like knives. He's not Joe. He plays that run-first style, not like us. The 49ers belong to Montana. For the next 7 years, Steve Young lived in that psychological hell. 7 years seen as the guy who came after, the temporary fix, the reluctant backup. 7 years standing behind a man Steve himself respected, but also suffocated by that very shadow day after day. Montana was the idol of the entire stadium. Steve was just the placeholder. Worse, Steve was a completely opposite style of quarterback from Montana. Montana was graceful, finesse. Steve was explosive, powerful, running like a running back. That difference made Steve doubted at the slightest mistake. If Montana threw slightly off, fans saw it as normal. But if Steve missed, the stands erupted in anger. See, that's why he's not Montana. 49ers fans split into two camps, tense like a civil war. Team Montana and Team Young. Team Montana was the overwhelming majority. They loved Montana like family. They saw Steve as an intruder. Just Steve coming onto the field in preseason and missing a pass would bring jeering whistles. There were practices where Steve overheard someone behind him say, "Why did we pay for this guy? Joe is the only one we need." To the media, Montana was the legend. In the locker room, Montana was the big brother. And Steve was a risky project. A player who was weird, hard to use, doesn't fit the system, will never be Montana. That burrowed deeper into Steve's mind than any tackle. Physical injuries could be healed with tape and medicine, but mental wounds lingered and silently festered. Some nights Steve drove home late, the streets of Santa Clara empty, streetlights casting yellow glows on the windshield. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from feeling like he was living a life that wasn't his own. He had left BYU in fear, left Tampa in disappointment, and now fallen into a place where no matter what he did, he was never good enough for anyone. Once in the locker room after a grueling practice, while Montana was still chatting with teammates, Steve sat alone in the corner, head down, feeling like the whole world was pressing on his shoulders. A staff member walked up, patted his shoulder and said, "You know what they want. They want Montana here forever." The comment was casual, but hit him like a punch to the gut. Steve has said that the time with the 49ers before becoming the starting QB, was the darkest period of his professional career. I knew I was strong. I knew I had the ability. But for years I felt like everyone had already decided I would never be good enough. And when Montana's injury gave Steve chances to play, the pressure became suffocating. Every time he took the field, it was an evaluation, not of tactics or technique, but of his worth as a person. Are you worthy of standing in Montana's spot? After every game, Steve didn't care if he won or lost. What haunted him was, will the fans ever accept me? Will my teammates believe in me? Am I the biggest mistake of my life? Many nights he lay in his small apartment in Palo Alto, streetlights casting blurred streaks through the window. He wondered if he had made a mistake continuing this career. Am I the flawed person they think I am? Am I broken? This was Steve Young's deepest tragedy. He wasn't defeated by opponents. He was defeated by comparison. As good as he was, as talented as he was, it still wasn't enough in everyone's eyes. But in that darkness, something else began to smolder, the stubbornness of a warrior. Steve didn't run away, didn't quit, didn't ask for a trade, didn't accept the fate of being a permanent backup. 7 years in Montana's shadow, 7 years dismissed, doubted, overlooked, didn't destroy Steve Young. It forged him. It created the coldest, toughest, and most resilient version of himself. A version the NFL was not prepared to face. But to become that man, Steve still had to endure painful injuries, hits that blackened everything before his eyes, and falls that left the entire country holding its breath. And that tragedy was still waiting ahead. After 7 years living in Montana's shadow, Steve Young stood before a choice that only those tormented by doubt could truly understand: either become the best version of himself, or become a name forgotten forever in NFL history. But what few know is that the journey to rise above it didn't happen on the field, but in small rooms, in the darkness, in the moments when Steve fought himself, the deepest root of every tragedy he had carried since childhood. Steve began a near-desperate process of rebuilding. He reviewed game tapes, not once or twice, but until he memorized every tiniest movement. He took meticulous notes to the point that coaches were astonished. Steve dissected every throw, every footstep, every second of reaction, as if performing surgery on his own soul. While teammates went home to rest, Steve stayed in the meeting room, light casting on his weary face, hand writing down mistakes that only someone obsessed with perfection could see. He pushed himself into extreme workouts, sprinting until his legs went numb, throwing until his shoulder burned with pain, lifting until his mind spun. Once, in a closed practice, after forcing one more set, Steve doubled over and vomited blood. The coach rushed over. The doctor immediately told him to stop. But Steve shook his head, wiped his mouth, stood up, and kept throwing. "Stopping now," he said, "only prolongs the doubt." Constant medical tests warned Steve was pushing his body to dangerous limits. Irregular heartbeat, wildly fluctuating blood pressure, a mind so stressed that even slight pressure could make him collapse. But Steve didn't listen. He couldn't listen, because in his head, the old voice still echoed, "You're never good enough." To overcome that voice, Steve needed more than muscle. He needed to change his mind. So amid the exhaustion of training, he began teaching himself psychology. He read books on anxiety, on the brain's defense mechanisms, on overcoming fear through thinking rather than fleeing. He realized that his whole life, he had been fighting battles no one saw: fear of abandonment, fear of failure, fear of others' eyes, fear of not being worthy. Once, in a notebook titled Mental Notes, Steve wrote, "I have to stop playing football with the heart of a scared child." That was the first time he admitted he was hurt, and the first time he decided to heal. But healing is never a gentle journey. Every time he stepped onto the field, Steve heard the crowd roar, tens of thousands of people glued to him. Stadium lights shone straight into his face, making him feel empty for a few seconds. The old anxiety rose again, tightening his body, but he began facing it instead of running. Before every game, he sat alone in the locker room, eyes closed, whispering to himself, "I deserve to be here. I'm good enough. I'm stronger than the fear." Once teammates saw him clutching his head in a private room, thinking he was in pain. But Steve wasn't in physical pain. He was battling the rapid breathing of a sudden anxiety attack. He had to learn to calm himself in the eye of the storm, a skill he would use throughout his career. And then gradually, through each game, each throw, each time he stood firm after a hit, Steve began to change. Not his skills, he already had those, but the person inside. He learned to stay silent amid boos, learned to turn mockery into fuel, learned to rise from mistakes without punishing himself, and most importantly, learned to forgive the timid boy from long ago. When a coach asked him, "What made you the strongest?" Steve simply replied, "Because I was once that weak." But that strength didn't come without cost. Steve's mind was worn down by expectations and pressure. He always carried the fear of failure like a shadow. His body was drained, constantly pushed to the edge. Every time he overtrained, his head jerked, vision blurred, ears rang. Those were signs of concussions deeply etched in his past that would haunt him for life. Yet Steve didn't back down. He knew that to escape Montana's shadow, he had to create something Montana couldn't offer, a true Steve Young style, powerful, daring, explosive, willing to run, to confront, to redefine the quarterback position, and he did it. But to reach that day, Steve paid with thousands of lonely hours, with nights tense to the point of suffocation, with sweat mixed with tears, with mental pain stretching back to childhood. Steve Young didn't rebuild himself just to become a great QB. He rebuilt himself to become a person strong enough to face himself. His success wasn't born from glory or natural talent. It was born from pain, a lingering pain that only silent warriors can endure and turn into strength. And from that pain, Steve Young began stepping into the greatest phase of his life, with strength not just in his legs and arms, but in a heart reforged in the fire of adversity. Steve Young's rise didn't lead him to the promised land. It took him straight into the center of a hell that only NFL quarterbacks truly understand. It wasn't a place of losses or media pressure, but a silent, ruthless hell that left wounds that never heal. Concussions. Hits to the head, seemingly normal in football, quietly destroyed Steve's life in ways he never expected, and that tragedy lasted decades, never leaving him for a single day. The first concussion happened when Steve was young, in a game where adrenaline masked all pain. A blindside tackle, a hit from the back the quarterback can't see, slammed his head into the turf. Everything blurred for seconds. When Steve tried to open his eyes, he saw double lines on the field, double referees, double images of the same world overlapping, double vision. His eyes couldn't focus, ears ringing, and for minutes, Steve couldn't remember his own name, couldn't remember which stadium he was playing in, couldn't remember what down it was. Teammates had to help him to the sideline. Steve forced a smile, said, "I'm fine," but inside he knew something was wrong. That night Steve sat alone in a dark room, feeling like his head was about to explode, but he stayed silent, didn't report it, didn't complain, because in the NFL, admitting pain could cost you your spot, and Steve was too used to fighting to prove himself. The third one was far crueler. It was the hit where America saw Steve Young lie motionless, arms limp, eyes closed, a tackle so hard it silenced the stadium for seconds. When Steve tried to stand, his knees buckled, his body no longer obeyed, all sounds distorted like echoing underwater. As he was helped off, Steve wondered if he was dreaming. The world spun around him, as if he stood in an invisible whirlwind. The third hit didn't just knock him out of the game, it started a repeating nightmare. Stabbing headaches, sudden memory blackouts, moments staring at the playbook but not understanding what he was reading. But Steve came back, kept practicing, kept throwing, because he believed the NFL was his destiny, and destiny, no matter how cruel, had to be accepted. But destiny didn't stop. The fifth time, Steve said he heard church bells ringing in his head. The sixth, he lost direction to the point that leaving the huddle, he forgot the called play. But the tragedy peaked at the seventh, the final concussion, the one that ended his career forever. It was the game against the Arizona Cardinals, October 3, 1999. Steve took a direct hit to the face mask. In an instant, stadium lights exploded into hundreds of white flashes. Steve collapsed, motionless, unmoving. Medical staff rushed in, fans held their breath. TV cameras zoomed on his face, and people saw those eyes once full of determination, now empty, lost. Steve didn't get up, couldn't speak, felt nothing but darkness. In the medical room the doctor leaned down, voice low but clear, "If you go back out there, you may not come back." Those words cut through Steve Young's life like a knife. A quarterback unafraid of opponents, unafraid of bad throws, unafraid of losing, now facing the greatest fear, death. Steve had faced thousands of hits in the NFL, but no one had ever told him the next one could be his last. The following weeks were the cruelest time. Steve couldn't get out of bed from dizziness, couldn't watch TV because light stabbed his head, couldn't read, couldn't focus on conversations. Just standing too fast made the world spin. Headaches struck suddenly, pain so intense he had to lie on the floor, hands clutching his head, waiting for it to pass like a storm. Some days Steve couldn't remember where he put his wallet, couldn't recall a conversation from minutes ago, couldn't remember driving somewhere. And even after retiring, that tragedy followed him for decades. At 60, Steve still woke with lingering pain behind his skull, still had days forgetting a familiar name, still had nights when head pain forced him to sit up, lean against the wall, breathe deeply. Steve once said, "I live with the ghosts of every hit." Those ghosts never disappear. They follow him in every quiet moment, reminding him that glory has a price, and that price was his body, his memory, and sometimes a piece of his soul. This is the real tragedy, heavier than any loss, any media pressure. The tragedy of a man who fought his whole life to stand tall, only to find that the most beautiful, bravest battles left the deepest wounds. But even paying with memory, health, and years of peace, Steve Young never regretted living as a warrior. He accepted those ghosts, not as a curse, but as proof that he loved, gave everything, and burned brightly for the NFL. And from that hell, Steve would step into the most glorious phase of his life, but no longer in the darkness of hits, but in the light of a victory no one, not even Steve, could have imagined. The victory at Super Bowl 29 was the moment when all of America saw Steve Young at his most brilliant, most powerful, unstoppable. But they didn't know that behind that glory stood a man reaching the pinnacle with bloodied feet, a head feeling like it was about to shatter, and a heart trembling from the fear that his career was nearing its end. After 7 concussions, after years living in Montana's shadow, after countless nights wondering if he was worthy, Steve Young slowly walked onto the field in Super Bowl 29, like the last warrior still standing on the battlefield. Facing him were the San Diego Chargers. On his shoulders was the weight of a team, a city, and an entire past that had haunted him for decades. But in the moment the ball was snapped, Steve didn't think about injuries, didn't think about the doctor's warning, didn't think about his career. He thought of one thing only: liberation. And then the unimaginable happened. Not Joe Montana, not any legendary quarterback in history. It was Steve Young, the man once seen as not enough, underestimated, considered too much of a runner, too reckless, too different, who threw 6 touchdown passes, breaking the Super Bowl record. When the 6th pass landed in Jerry Rice's hands, Steve tilted his head back to the sky, arms outstretched as if to embrace the entire Miami heavens. Teammates rushed to hug him, fans screamed, the media exploded. The whole world finally had to acknowledge Steve Young had escaped Montana's shadow. He was no longer the replacement, no longer the guy who came after. He was the champion, the Super Bowl MVP, the icon. But in that very moment, with the sun shining on his red and gold helmet, beneath that hard plastic shell, Steve felt a stab in his head, like someone had driven a knife through his skull. He had taken many hits throughout the season. His body was held together only by will and adrenaline. The joy was radiant, but the pain was right behind it. After the Lombardi Trophy ceremony, reporters crowded in, flashes popping non-stop. Steve forced the biggest smile he could. He hugged friends, shook hands with the coach, celebrated with teammates. But when it all ended, when he walked alone into his hotel room, with his jersey still smelling of grass, the truth came out. His head hurt like it was about to explode. His heart raced irregularly. Sweat poured even though his body was cold. Steve sat on the edge of the bed, took off his shoes, and in seconds, his whole body shook. The hotel lights were too bright, the air conditioner too loud, everything spun. The night he became Super Bowl MVP was also the night he realized his career was entering its final chapter. Everyone thought he was ecstatic, but in that darkness, Steve whispered to himself, "If I wake up tomorrow with my head still hurting like this, can I keep playing?" In the outside world, Steve was the champion. But in this quiet room, he was a 33-year-old man afraid he had just traded his future for today's victory. He put a cold cloth on his head, leaned against the wall, closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, the joy of victory mixed with the fear of losing himself. No one said this on television. No one wants to hear the champion complain about pain. But the tragic truth is this: the pinnacle always demands a price, and Steve knew he had paid with his own body. The next morning, accepting the MVP award, Steve smiled, but his eyes were veiled with a thin mist. He felt like he was walking between two worlds, one of glory he had chased his whole life, and one of darkness where his career was being shortened, day by countless hits no one could count. Victory had never been so sweet and bitter at once. Steve once said, "I felt like I got the monkey off my back, but then I realized it had left its claws." Super Bowl 29 was the night of liberation, but also the night fate whispered in his ear that his time was running out faster than he thought. And that was just the beginning of the final battle Steve Young would face, a battle with no audience, no field, no trophy, just him and the pain that would follow him into his 60s. The Super Bowl 29 victory should have opened the most glorious chapter of Steve Young's life. But instead, it opened the final one, a chapter he never wanted to write. Lingering headaches, sudden loss of balance, moments of memory vanishing in seconds, all became cruel reminders that his body was slowly betraying him. Steve wanted to keep playing, wanted to defend the throne he had just won with blood and tears, but every time he ran onto the practice field, every overly hard throw, every light tap on the helmet, his head stabbed like needles. The team's medical experts began to worry, the coach worried, his family worried, but Steve didn't, or rather he deliberately refused to face the truth. He said, "I'm fine, it's just headaches, I can play." But the doctors knew better than anyone, the cost of one more hit could be never waking up. One fateful day, Steve walked into the team doctor's office, cold white lights. A group of doctors sat across from him, on the tables CT scans, neurological test results, high-risk concussion indicators. No one smiled, no one softened the words. Finally, the oldest doctor, who had followed Steve for years, placed his hand on the table and said straight, "You cannot play anymore. One more concussion, and we can't be sure you'll come back." Those words were like a gunshot signaling the end of an era. Steve looked at them, eyes wide but no reaction. For seconds, he seemed to lose the ability to breathe. His throat dried up, his heart pounded hard, then slowed. All sounds vanished, only those words repeating in his head. He tried to ask, "Is there any other way?" The doctor shook his head. No miracle, no second chance, no exception for wounds too deep. That night, Steve Young sat in his car, hands on the wheel, eyes staring ahead but seeing nothing. Tears fell without him noticing. "I'm not ready. I have so much more I want to do. I can't leave the NFL, not like this." For others, retirement is a natural part of a career, but for Steve, it was the loss of a piece of his soul. The NFL wasn't just a job, it was where he fought when no one believed in him, where he overcame fear, doubt, and the ghosts of his life, where he found his self-worth. And now he had to leave it, not because of age, not because of declining performance, but because his body could no longer protect him. When the 49ers held the press conference, Steve tried to smile, tried to say positive things, tried to act like he had accepted it all, but his voice shook, his eyes were red, and the whole world knew he was trying to swallow a pain no trophy could ease. After the press conference, Steve asked to stay on the field a few more minutes. When everyone had left, he walked out to the middle of Levi's Stadium, the great field, the 49ers Cathedral. No fans, no cheers, no bright lights, just Steve Young alone. He took off his helmet, placed his hand on the grass. It was the turf where he had been slammed down, bounced back, fought tirelessly, cried from pain, shouted in victory. He looked up at the empty stands. The silent seats now became shadows tightening his chest. He whispered, "I don't want to go yet. I'm not ready to go." The wind blew gently. The vast field seemed to swallow his loneliness. In that moment, Steve Young was not the MVP, not the legend, not the Hall of Famer. He was just a man forced to leave what he loved most. And that is the tragedy of every hero. They never choose how they leave the game. They are only forced to go when the body no longer lets the heart keep fighting. Steve stood up, took a deep breath, and walked away, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only thing he could do to protect the life he had left. But as he left the field that day, he carried a lingering ache that would never fade. The NFL had taken more from him than glory. It had taken a piece of his soul nothing could replace. Retirement was not the end of the pain. It was only the silence that opened the door for the real tragedy to begin. When the stadium lights went out, when the cheers faded, when the interviews and praise died down, Steve Young entered a chapter of life no playbook could guide. The chapter of lingering pain, stolen sleep and quiet fear gnawing at his mind every night. Concussion after effects don't vanish with time. On the contrary, they grow. In middle age, Steve began experiencing what doctors had warned about, things he thought he had escaped by retiring early. Headaches striking without warning, like lightning ripping across his skull. Every time he bent down to pick something up, his head spun. His neck ached constantly, as if an invisible cord was tightening around his spine. His heart sometimes raced so fast he had to lean against the wall to stay upright. But physical pain was not as frightening as the nights he couldn't sleep. Some nights Steve lay awake, not because he wanted to, but because his body wouldn't let him. Just closing his eyes for minutes, he would jolt awake, forehead drenched in sweat, heart pounding like he was sprinting. He didn't know what triggered the panic. He only knew that even in sleep his brain was still fighting the ghosts of hundreds of past hits. One winter night, when everyone in the house was asleep, Steve went to the kitchen for water. As he raised the glass to his lips, a sharp pain shot from his temple to his jaw. His vision went black. His body collapsed onto the cold tile floor. He lay there for minutes, gasping like he had just run the length of the field. No one witnessed it. No one heard. When he struggled to stand, hands still shaking, a terrifying thought flashed: what if next time I don't get up? That question became a constant obsession. Not fear of failure like in his youth, not fear of comparison, but fear of death, dying in silence, dying from injuries fans had cheered him to take as part of the game. Steve once said in a private interview, "Retirement didn't stop the pain, it just gave me more time to feel it." And that was completely true. No more practice schedule, no more adrenaline, no more games to make him forget his body, just difficult mornings, endless nights and moments facing the truth that the body of an NFL legend can deteriorate faster than an ordinary person's. Some nights he lay staring at the ceiling, listening to his heart pound in the darkness. He placed his hand on his chest, feeling the irregular rhythm. He tried deep breathing, tried reassuring himself he was fine. But then the question returned: what if I die in my sleep? It wasn't baseless fear. Doctors had told him that people with multiple concussions have higher risks of cardiovascular or neurological issues during sleep. Steve knew it, and every night he lived with the worry he might not wake up the next morning. Some nights he sat on the edge of the bed, feet on the floor, hands clutching his graying hair. His wife Barbara would wake in the middle of the night and see Steve still awake. "Are you in pain again?" Steve would just nod lightly, not wanting to worry her more. But inside he knew this pain wasn't temporary. It was the NFL's permanent reminder that glory is never free. A body that was once his greatest weapon had become something he lived in fear of. Joints creaked every time he got out of bed. Knees stabbed in cold weather. Neck felt stretched whenever he turned his head too fast. And worst, his memory betrayed him in the cruelest way. Once he stood in the kitchen, opened the fridge, then forgot why he was there. Steve, the man who once memorized a 300-page playbook in days, was now fighting to remember the most ordinary things. The NFL gave him fame, money, a place in the Hall of Fame, but it also took the most ordinary things in life: sleep, peace, the certainty that tomorrow he would still be himself. That is the great tragedy of Steve Young. Behind the glory is a decaying body, nights when he fears his own sleep, and though fans still remember him as an indomitable warrior, only Steve knows that the hardest battle of his life didn't happen on the field, but inside him, on those sleepless dark nights, where the ghosts of the NFL still refused to let go. Even though his body had endured enough nameless pains, the tragedy of Steve Young didn't stop there. Because as he entered his 50s and 60s, when many of his generation had found peace in family, hobbies, and rest, Steve had to face an old enemy he thought had been buried since childhood: anxiety. That fear no longer came from the field. It came from the invisible pressures of life after the spotlight, where he had to learn to exist without the protection of a helmet or the cheers of tens of thousands of fans. When Steve joined ESPN as an analyst, fans thought he was living a second dream, comfortable, easy, just talking about football, the thing he'd lived for his whole life. But the reality was a whirlwind of pressure. What if I say something wrong? What if I'm not as sharp as before? What if they think I'm outdated? Those questions surrounded Steve every day, every hour, every time he stepped into the studio. The studio lights, which were just ordinary light to others, triggered memories of the thousands of judging eyes on the field. His heart raced when the camera light turned red. His hands sometimes went ice cold, as if he were back to being the trembling BYU student afraid of being left alone. At 50, when a person's heart should be at its steadiest, Steve felt as fragile as in childhood. The anxiety attacks returned, powerful, sudden, without warning. In the middle of an ESPN meeting, he suddenly couldn't hear anyone speaking, all sounds muffled. During a live broadcast, he felt his throat tighten, unable to get words out. His hands shook lightly under the desk. The audience couldn't see, but Steve felt it clearly, heartbreakingly. But what haunted Steve most wasn't the anxiety. It was the fear of being forgotten, the fear that had followed him since Tampa Bay, when he was seen as the replacement. Even as a Hall of Famer, Super Bowl MVP, with a career any quarterback would dream of, deep down Steve still carried the feeling, I have to keep proving something, I'm not good enough. That was the psychological aftermath of a lifetime fighting doubt and comparison. From the child afraid of leaving family, to the lonely BYU student, to the booed Buccaneers player, to the overwhelming shadow of Montana, to the years the NFL crushed his body, all of it formed a complete picture, a vulnerable heart inside a warrior's body. At 55, Steve once said there were evenings he sat alone in the living room chair, staring at the dark TV, the house silent, feeling a nameless sadness, not because he had failed, not because he lacked anything, but because he feared that what he had done wasn't enough for people to remember him, feared that the new generation of the NFL would forget his extraordinary runs, feared that ESPN, where he was pouring his heart, would one day replace him with a younger face. Those anxieties weren't temporary. They lasted for years, sometimes causing sleepless nights, sometimes forcing him to step out of meetings to breathe deeply, sometimes making him fear himself, fear his mind was returning to childhood. When little Steve Young cried from fear of abandonment, once after filming, Steve stayed in the empty studio, lights off. He stood in the middle of the floor, looking around at no one, and he felt empty. Why do I still feel like I'm racing? Why do I still feel like it's not enough? He asked himself that in sorrow. That is the deepest psychological tragedy. Even as a legend, Steve Young still felt he had to prove he deserved to be loved. Anxiety, the enemy he thought he'd defeated, returned in his 50s and 60s, to remind him that the past never disappears. It just waits for the moment he's vulnerable to knock again. But Steve, as he had his whole life, still got up, still fought, still used the pain to become stronger, because he understood, sometimes the greatest victory isn't on the field, but over the shadows in one's own soul. Amid the years of psychological turmoil, amid anxiety attacks so heavy they left him breathless, Steve Young found a light he never thought would save his life: love. Barbara Graham entered Steve's life, not as a loud miracle, but as a warm breeze slipping into the darkest corners of his soul. She didn't see Steve as an NFL legend, not as the MVP, the Hall of Famer, the man who broke Super Bowl records. She saw something else, A kind, sensitive person, a man carrying far too many wounds that few truly understood. When Steve was tormented by anxiety from ESPN, when night fell, and he sat in the living room chair with lightly trembling hands, Barbara didn't ask rational questions like, "What's wrong?" or "Is something up?" She just sat beside him, placed her hand on his, and said, "It's okay. You don't have to fight alone." And in that moment, the man accustomed to holding up the world by himself, finally allowed himself to be vulnerable. Their marriage wasn't a fairy tale where wounds vanish. It was a story where wounds are seen and loved. On sleepless nights that left Steve exhausted, Barbara made him hot tea. When headaches tormented him to the point he had to lie still, Barbara lay beside him, quietly placing her hand on his shoulder. When their children, Braden, Jackson, McKay, Summer, grew up and began realizing their dad wasn't like other dads, couldn't run and play freely, couldn't do intense activities, Steve felt heartbroken. But the kids didn't see it as a loss. They saw a hero. To them, Dad was the man who had fought his whole life, so they didn't need him to run, they just needed him there. Every evening Steve read books to his kids, even when the words blurred from headaches. Every morning he saw them off at the door, even after a full night without sleep. Every moment with his children was medicine no hospital could prescribe, and they kept him going. On days he feared he might collapse again, but even in that happiness, fear crept in. Steve once confessed that some nights he watched his kids sleep and wondered, what if the concussion after effects take me early? Will I have time to teach them to grow up, to tell them I love them? That was a pain no one saw, the pain of a father knowing time might not be on his side. In moments of weakness, Steve turned to what had nurtured him since childhood, his Mormon faith. Faith didn't erase fear, it just helped him stand firm in it. On evenings when his head throbbed and his heart beat irregularly, Steve opened the scriptures and read slowly, letting each word pull him back from the edge of anxiety. In church, standing beside Barbara and the kids, holding hands, he felt that even if his body weakened, his soul belonged to something greater than this pain. That faith helped Steve believe each extra day he lived was a gift, not punishment. But what makes this chapter beautiful and painful is the truth that happiness doesn't make tragedy disappear. It only makes the tragedy deeper, because now, Steve wasn't just fighting for his own life, he was fighting to stay with the people he loved. Once, Barbara hugged him tightly and said, "You don't have to be strong all the time." Steve just shook his head lightly. "I have to be strong, because I'm not ready to leave you and the kids." And that is the salvation of Steve Young's life. Love doesn't cure the pain, but it gives him a reason to keep going, even with trembling legs, a heavy heart, and a past that still pursues him. Marriage, children, and faith don't erase the tragedy, but they turned Steve from a solitary warrior into a man with a place to come home to. And sometimes, that's the only miracle a wounded life needs. Entering his 60s, Steve Young no longer resembled the man who once shook the NFL, who ran through defenses as if gravity couldn't hold him. Instead, every morning began with a silent battle. No cheers, no teammates, no stadium lights, just a once glorious body, now slowly decaying from the hits of the past. Before the sun rose, Steve was already awake, not from an alarm, but from chronic pain pulling him out of sleep. His neck stiffened as if someone was tightening it, his head pulsated with each beat, hurting like a hammer striking his skull, his back cramped, both knees stabbed with pain. It took minutes just to sit up, more minutes to stand straight without dizziness. That was the reality of a warrior who paid with his body for immortal moments on the field. And sometimes, when trying to recall an old game, a classic throw, a training camp day at BYU, Steve only felt emptiness. Memories once as close as his own blood now faded, blurred, even vanished. Friends would say, "Remember?" Steve wanted to say yes, but the truth was, no. Those moments hurt more than headaches, because memories are a legend's life, and now part of that life was falling away. Every day Steve spent 90 minutes in physical therapy, never missing one. Neck stretches, balance control exercises, deep breathing, neural regulation exercises, all to keep his body from collapsing too fast. The therapist had to remind him of every movement. "Slow down, Steve, don't turn fast. Keep your neck straight, And he, the man who once dodged 250-pound tackles, now had to relearn how to turn his head without getting dizzy. His vision had noticeably declined. Bright light triggered headaches. While driving, he squinted to read signs. While reading books, he held them farther away than normal. His reflexes, once his sharpest weapon, now lagged a few beats. One doctor said bluntly, "This is inevitable for someone with multiple concussions. Your body is aging faster than your actual age." But perhaps the most painful was the moment he stepped into the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and didn't recognize the man looking back. Not because he disliked growing old, not because he missed youth, but because he saw changes not from time, but from the NFL taking too much. His eyes were deeper set, cheeks sunken, wrinkles deep like traces of every hit, every sleepless night, every anxiety attack. He lightly touched the mirror, whispering, "Back then I was so strong." But what makes Steve Young most beautiful and tragic is even as his body weakens, his will never collapses. Despite the pain, he still teaches his kids to throw a ball, not to make them players, but to teach them courage. When standing on the field with his sons, he can't run fast anymore, can't throw far anymore, but his eyes shine as brightly as ever, passing on lessons he paid for with his youth. Despite the fatigue, he still attends Forever Young Foundation charity events, hugging each child, listening to painful stories he understands better than anyone. To the scared children, he says, "You're not broken, you're just fighting like I did back then." And in his eyes, people see the truth. He says it not to comfort, but because he lived it himself. Even with fading memory, Steve still stands on stage talking about resilience, not with exaggeration, but with the sincerity of someone who has been knocked down by life many times, yet still gets up, even with trembling legs. He no longer talks about tactics, no longer talks about glory. He talks about survival, the hardest thing for someone who has spent his life fighting pain, anxiety, and memories that are gradually fading. Once after a speech, a young man asked him, "Do you wish you could change the past?" Steve smiled, his eyes tinged with sadness. "I wish I didn't hurt like this, but I don't wish to erase the path I've taken, because it taught me the value of courage." That is the tragic grandeur of Steve Young in his 60s and beyond. A body decayed by the NFL, a memory worn away by time and injury, a face he sometimes doesn't recognize. But the heart that once trembled with anxiety, is now more resilient than at any moment in his career. Steve Young in his 60s and beyond is no longer the invincible warrior. He is the warrior who still stands even after life has pulled him down hundreds of times. And it is precisely that fragility, that weakness, that pain that makes him a living legend in the most beautiful and painful sense. In his 60s and beyond, when his body is no longer whole and memories sometimes betray him, Steve Young begins to look back on his life like a thick book, each page a scar, but also a victory. And it is those scars, not the trophies, that truly form his legacy. The NFL doesn't remember Steve Young just for the 6 touchdown passes in Super Bowl 29, not for the 2 MVPs, not for the runs that sliced through defenses like lightning. The NFL remembers Steve because he was a warrior, who walked into fire without tiring, who fought pain without boasting, who got up after every hit without complaining, who gave so much that his body paid the price for the rest of his life. In the 49ers meeting rooms, when people mention him, they don't just say Steve Young, one of the greats, they say Steve Young, the man who never gave up. That is his image, a quarterback who didn't just run with speed, but with heart. A player who turned every fall into a lesson for the whole team, an icon of resilience, not perfection. But what makes his legacy extend beyond the field is the everyday man Steve Young is. After retiring, he didn't turn himself into a proud TV star, didn't live extravagantly, didn't show off. Despite brilliant success in business with HGGC, he remained the shy, humble man, always ready to smile embarrassedly when someone mentioned his achievements. Colleagues say Steve walks into board meetings like an intern, not like a millionaire. He listens more than he speaks. He empathizes more than he criticizes, because he knows what it feels like to be undervalued, knows what it's like to have to prove your worth every day. and he vows never to make anyone else feel that way. But where Steve's legacy shines brightest is in the Forever Young Foundation, the charity he co-founded to support children facing hardship, lacking opportunities, lacking love, lacking faith in themselves. He builds schools, he funds hospitals, he creates playgrounds for children with disabilities. He goes to places with no beautiful fields, no lights, no cheers, places where silent pain is exactly like the pain he carried through his childhood. Once, visiting a center for children with anxiety and emotional disorders, a little boy asked him, "Have you ever been scared like me?" Steve took the boy's hand and answered as if speaking to his 6-year-old self, "Yes, and being scared doesn't make you weak. It teaches you how to get back up." That is the greatest message his life leaves behind. Because if there is one thing Steve Young has proven through every chapter of his life, it is this: true glory doesn't come from winning, but from how we get up after pain. Glory isn't the Lombardi Trophy, but teaching his kids to throw a ball despite aching body. Not the MVP title, but fighting anxiety to be a complete father. Not 6 touchdown passes, but getting up 6 times after each terrifying hit. Glory is turning tragedy into compassion, pain into strength, an anxious childhood into boundless empathy for the vulnerable. Steve Young's legacy isn't in the record books, it's in the hearts of the children he helped, in the eyes of teammates who watched him fight to the last second, in the moments fans remember him not as a perfect legend, but as a fragile man who kept going, tired but still standing, in pain but never losing his kindness. And that is the beauty from the scars, beauty that time cannot erase, and darkness cannot swallow. In everything he has done, what remains deepest isn't the games, but the lesson he leaves. We are not great because we never fall. We are great because we get up, even knowing we'll fall again. And then, standing at the end of the journey in his 60s and beyond, body weary but heart still steadfast, Steve Young looks back on his life like a long film, where light and darkness intertwine so tightly they cannot be separated. He has won more than any anxious child ever dared dream. He has lost more than any legend ever dared admit. He has run fast, thrown far, conquered the NFL in a way only Steve Young could. But he has also collapsed, trembled, lost important parts of his body and memory that he can never get back. That is the price of being a legend. If life is a book, every chapter of Steve's is written in red ink, the color of blood, passion, sacrifice, and pain. From the Mormon boy afraid to leave his family, to the BYU young man trembling in dorm walls, to the Tampa Bay quarterback booed, doubted, drowned, to the man who lived 7 years under Montana's shadow, to the NFL warrior who endured 7 concussions, to the Super Bowl hero standing at the peak of glory, but that night holding his head in darkness from exploding pain, to the middle-aged father afraid he won't wake from sleep, to the man in his 60s and beyond, looking in the mirror and unsure if the person staring back is himself. A beautiful life, but never easy, a glorious life, but always with darkness right behind. And what makes Americans love Steve Young isn't his perfection, it's that he chose not to resent, even when he had every reason to. The NFL took his physical strength, but he didn't resent. The NFL took his memories, but he didn't resent. The NFL took his peaceful nights, but he didn't resent. The NFL made him love his whole life with the ghosts after every hit, but he still smiles when asked if he regrets it. He answers no, because if I regretted it, I'd have to deny the most beautiful things in my life. He chose to love his wife Barbara, the one who pulled him from the abyss of anxiety, love his children, the angels who made him a more emotional man than any glory ever could, love the game that destroyed part of his body, but also gave him the chance to stand before America as an icon. He chose to live. Live with the pain. Live with fragmented memory. Live with a body that no longer obeys. Live with old age coming earlier than for others, but still live full of gratitude. He chose to forgive. Forgive the NFL for making him pay too high a price. Forgive himself for the years of self-doubt. Forgive fate for taking him through challenges that ordinary people could never imagine. And when standing before the children he helps through the Forever Young Foundation, Steve Young understands that the scars on his body, whether physical or mental, all have a purpose. They make him kinder, more humble, deeper, more able to touch the hearts of others. And that is when he realizes the true legacy of a life is not what we achieve, but what we leave in the hearts of others. When Americans look at Steve Young's life, they don't just see an MVP, a Hall of Famer, a 49ers icon. They see a man who fought his whole life to be loved, and finally learned that the greatest love begins with forgiving himself, and as someone who has collided with darkness more than light, Steve sends America a message, gentle yet sharp as a blade. Live fully, because every day we walk with scars no one sees, but it is those scars that make us beautiful. That is the tragic, epic conclusion of an imperfect life, yet one incredibly worth living, a life that Steve Young paid for, fought for, and ultimately won in the most beautiful way. Steve Young's life, when looked back upon through each part of the story, emerges like a beautiful but pain-soaked epic, a life where glory and tragedy are inseparable, where every victory was paid for with a part of his body, a part of his memory, a part of his soul. It's hard not to feel sorrow when recalling the image of the little boy with separation anxiety, trembling every night from fear of being left behind, then the lonely BYU student who many times wanted to quit football, then the Tampa Bay player sitting alone in a hotel room, hands shaking from pressure, or the San Francisco quarterback endlessly compared, living in Montana's shadow for 7 long years. That pain didn't disappear. It only changed form when he collapsed after 7 concussions, when the doctor whispered, "If you go back out there, you may not come back," when he became Super Bowl MVP, but that night lay alone in a dark room with a head hurting like it was exploding. And then in his 60s and beyond, Steve still has to live with the after effects that blur his memory, stiffen his body, turning every morning wake-up into a battle. But what makes us bow in respect isn't his glorious moments, but the way he chose to get up from the cruelest falls. Steve didn't resent the NFL, didn't resent fate. He chose love, chose to build a family, chose to help children, chose to turn wounds into a legacy of compassion. And that is the lesson that the people of the United States, a society that values strength, but sometimes forgets to see invisible pain, need to remember. Scars don't make us weaker. Scars are proof that we have lived, fought, and courageously overcome darkness. Live fully, kindly, and bravely enough to get up, even knowing life will continue to challenge us. If this tragic, epic story of Steve Young's journey touches you, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in other human stories. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the strength of people who carry within them the most beautiful scars.